to Dialogue Across Difference, an event series hosted by the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Join us as Center Director Larry Jacobs and guests engage in conversations across the political and policy spectrum on issues of the day.
Good afternoon. I am Larry Jacobs. I'm a professor here at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, University of Minnesota, and I direct the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance. I want to welcome all of you joining us online and the folks who are joining us here. Very pleased to welcome you to the fourth event in our Mondale Dialogues series. It's a lecture series that is devoted to the decency and fairness of Vice President Walter Mondale and the principles he fought for. The series is made possible by George and Penny George and by the George Family Foundation, and we thank them. Before we begin, I want to encourage all of you here and then folks online, give us questions. We love questions. If you're joining us online, you'll see at the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A button. Use it. You'll see I'm going to be bringing some of those questions in, and we can always use more. Also, if you're online and you'd like some use closed captioning, you'll see that's also an option at the bottom of the screen, and welcome you to use that. Very pleased to welcome our guest today, Sarah Binder. Sarah Binder is a senior fellow in the Governance Studies program at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. She's also a political science professor at George Washington University, where she specializes in Congress and legislative politics. Perfect guest for this moment in American politics. She has an extraordinary record of publication and recognition for that. And by the way, we want to welcome Professor Binder back. She did get her PhD here at the University of Minnesota's Department of Political Science, and we're always delighted to have our graduates return. Well, here we are. This is quite a moment in American politics, and particularly around the budgets. And I want to just start with a few words about Walter Mondale. We're kind of meeting and having this conversation in which our concerns about the breakdown of budgeting in Washington is very real. Here we've got Department of Homeland Security budget, it's deadlocked. We've got huge lines in airports, and that is in many ways a reflection of what we're going to be talking about today. Why is that happening? If you go back to the fall, again, government shutdown, it seems to be a continual pattern in American politics. Why is that happening? And is there anything we can do about it? Professor Binder is the person who's going to give us the answer to those intriguing questions. It also connects to Walter Mondale. Walter Mondale, of course, was a liberal icon, responsible for some of the most important legislation passed during the 1960s and 70s, including Medicare, civil rights legislation. He was the pioneer and leader of the fair housing law. There would be no fair housing if it wasn't for Walter Mondale and his leadership. So here you've got a liberal icon, but here's a part of Walter Mondale's legacy that is not widely known today. He was also someone who insisted on fiscal discipline and accountability. And he led an effort to pass what was known as the 1984 Congressional Budget and Impoundment Act. And this was a kind of a landmark piece of legislation that established much of the architecture of conversations about the budget that we're going to be talking about today. This is back, 50 years ago. Wow. And here are some of the things that act established. It hadn't existed before, but this act that Walter Mondale was such a critical part of was passed. First, it created budget committees in both the House and the Senate. It also created the congressional budget resolution, which allowed Congress to set aggregate targets for spending, for taxing, for deficits and surplus and the debt. Congress hadn't done that before. So you can see kind of an effort to try to create some coherence in how Congress was handling its responsibilities for having the power of the purse. Third, This 1974 piece of legislation created something known as the Congressional Budget Office. And this is a very powerful institution in Congress. It's staffed with a lot of experts in budgeting and economics and other areas, so that Congress has the capacity to collect data and analyze it on its own to figure out the fiscal consequences of the legislation that it's considering, bills that are proposed, as well as those that are coming up for a vote. This was and remains a profound change in how Congress acts. It created procedures for budgeting, and one of them is very well known, at least among those of you who follow conversations about budgeting. It's known as reconciliation. And the idea was to bring tax and mandatory spending into alignment, to force legislature, Congress, to align its fiscal legislation with its agreed budget framework. So stop the irresponsibility. That was the idea of the reconciliation process. Now, you might already be thinking, is that what's happening today? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about with Sarah Binder. Professor Binders, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me and inviting me back. It's awesome to be here.
So why did this happen? I mean, let's just start in 1974. This is, it stands out to 50 years later. It's a big moment. Why did it happen?
Sure. So I think the way to understand, to think about the 1974 Act is to think, first of all, to put it in kind of historical perspective, because there are long-range forces that led Congress to this moment. And then also to think about what else is going on in the early 70s period, not just on budgets, but especially on war and other relationships with the president. So just briefly, the long story here, if we had to characterize sort of fiscal policymaking generally, this was a century of Congress actively delegating authority to the president. They did it on budgets in 1921. There had never been a federal budget before, and they don't give that power to themselves. They give it to the president, right? In the creation of what the precursor of what today is OMB. So on budgetary powers, it's been delegated to the president, right? Even though Congress has the power of the purse, right? They're giving sort of the president a little in on Article 1, power of the purse. They did it on war, especially in the wake of World War II. They create the CIA. This is Congress enacting. CIA, National Security Agency. They do it on, think about just general levels of military preparedness, right? What we now think of as a standing army. We see it on trade. They delegate authority to the president on trade. What happens when Congress faces Nixon in the late 60s and early 70s, where they feel they have this, as others have said, an imperial president, right? Waging war in Southeast Asia with little transparency to Congress. Also then on budgets, impounding money, which is not spending money that Congress had delegated. It's those types of pressures where Congress says, remarkably, enough is enough. And we see a host of efforts, including the Congressional Budget Act. So the 74 moment is, keep in mind, it's a very large Democratic majority facing off a Republican president, but a lot, pretty widespread Republican support for these efforts as well. They do it on budget, they do it on the War Powers Resolution, a little bit on trade. So more generally, the moment is recouping power from, or trying to recoup power from the president, but especially on the power of the purse.
How's it worked out?
Well, I think that the easiest, quickest answer is, well, certainly if you were standing in Houston, George W. Bush Airport this morning and we're looking at the 4-hour TSA wait, you would say, not so well, right? Congress somehow has not managed to fund the TSA agents. So from that moment, right, the visible, right, the thing we can see the most in our headlines about whether or not the budget process is working, not very well. We have benchmarks, deadlines in the Act. By October 1st, all what we call appropriations bills should be enacted into law. The last time they did that was in 1996. and that even my bad math skills could tell you was several decades ago. Look at the rise of the debt to GDP ratios. We're, depending on how you count things, close to 100%. Past rises in the increases in the debt after war or economic crises go down, but not anymore. It just steadily keeps rising. So debt, deficits, inability to legislate spending bills, shutdowns, not so good.
And I'm curious, when you think about why it's not worked, could you put your finger on a reason? Was there, these are pretty smart people. Walter Mondale had been around the block. Was it kind of an oopsie moment? Like, only if they had done this piece of legislation or tweaked it this way, it would have worked. I mean, put on your hat as a kind of an astute student of Washington politics. What went wrong?
So I think things went wrong in a couple of dimensions. First, keep in mind the point of having Congress write a budget and giving it deadlines was that the sort of challenging the president and trying to recoup the delegated power. And Congress has been really no match for the inordinate amount of power that presidents have and claim and use. And so right off the bat, the purpose of the act, they struggle. Congress struggles, and we can come to why that is. But the other thing that the act ensured, or the act was intended to ensure, was there was going to kind of have to have some coordination within Congress. And so when we think about the Congressional Budget Act, sometimes we think just in terms of interbranch relations, right? Congress not being able to challenge the president. But Congress did not exactly live up to the expectations under the act, that there would be a new budget committee in each chambers. And the budget committee would have basically some influence over the folks writing laws and the appropriators. And lawmakers don't want to give up their power even to each other and even to their own parties. And so that, on the face of it, and we can again think about why things turn out so badly, that for starters means that the rules themselves weren't enough, right? But people today have said the process isn't the problem is the problem. So we want to figure out what's the problem, like what at core is the problem. And just one caveat, I came across this, there was a seminar in October 1974, like just a couple months after, first of all, Nixon had signed it into law and then resigned. And it was basically this sort of seminar around the table of some lawmakers, some analysts, some political scientists, like, what is this thing we've created on the Congressional Budget Act? And they were very loud. They'd been around the block for sure as well. And they sort of understood that the onus would be on lawmakers to make the system work. And it didn't. Why not? First and foremost, rising partisan polarization, right? That these expectations that you could work across the lines, party lines, it didn't happen. Largely not just because the parties, Democrats move all to the left, Republicans moved all to the right, very few people in the center, hard to anchor a deal unless both parties get what they want. That type of partisanship, that partisan team play, undermined the purpose of these sort of coordinating budgets.
So just to take an example, I mean, reconciliation was a kind of a neat idea in 1974. It was the way in which Congress could align what it was saying in terms of spending with taxes. Well, that seems like a good idea. We have to reconcile it. And in the past, Congress hadn't done that. It was kind of every committee for itself. Well, that's not the way things have worked out. Reconciliation has turned into kind of a weapon in just the kind of partisan battle and polarization you're talking about.
So it's absolutely correct. To think about it here, the parties have different priorities. And given how difficult it is to legislate generally in Congress, not exclusively because of the Senate's filibuster rule, so that you need large bipartisan majorities to get stuff done. That's not the only reason they struggle. But the budget process is there, it's on the books, and it becomes a very sort of attractive target for whichever party, if there's unified party control, House, Senate, and White House with one party, and keep in mind, not just rising partisanship, but rising electoral competition, so that if you gain the majority, the expectation is you're probably going to lose it in the midterm. And so there's such focus, especially from the White House, to get your party's agenda pushed. And there it is, sitting on the shelf. Reconciliation. You can't filibuster under the rules of reconciliation bill. And it's become this battle. So Republicans fine tune it. They say, we're going to we can come to how they've done this, but they now use it for tax cuts, which increases the deficit as opposed to lowering the deficit, in theory, the purpose of the Budget Act. Democrats on their side have found it as a way to expand the broaden the social safety net, certainly Medicare, all sorts of, also on climate change of late. So each party weaponizes it to pursue their policy agendas, for good or for bad, but it's also been just adding deficits and deficits on top of each other.
And you've done, very important research on the filibuster. Democrats, when they were in the majority but lacked the filibuster, and now Republicans are in the majority but lack the 60 votes to overcome the filibuster. There are groups that just bash their head against the wall saying, why do we have this filibuster? Let's get rid of it and have a majority rule. Why is it that we see Republicans today and Democrats, when they had the majority, resisting the temptation just to sweep away the filibuster? I mean, why chain yourself to this limitation?
So I think, first of all, there have been incremental changes in the rules, and I think of it as this long, very long march towards majority rule. Like, they're getting there. When they change the rules, I think it's fair to say they've never undone the changes. They've never restored minority rights. So banned filibusters of nominations, banned filibusters in various laws, trade acts, and so forth. So will they ever actually fully abolish the legislative filibuster? I don't know, but that's certainly the motion they're going to. So, why have they done it? First of all, you need everybody on the same page in the majority party. They have to think that they're all going to be better off. They're going to be better off than worse off when the tables turn and the minority can use the lack of a filibuster against them. But second, it's very convenient to avoid blame when your party can't get something done, right? Case in point, the Save America Act, which is on and off the floor of late the last week, right? Republicans have it on the floor because they know how much President Trump and Republican activists want it. Ultimately, they'll keep failing on these 60-vote rules, and they'll blame the Democrats, but it's not clear Republicans have the votes.
You use the phrase that I just want to kind of put a spotlight on. You use the phrase minority rights. Now, it may seem to some folks, what does she mean minority rights? Republicans are in the majority. So what do you mean by minority rights from the perspective of Republicans today?
Well, there are a couple different ways to think about it. One is just simply like the procedural rights given to small coalitions, and today typically party coalitions. So the notion that in the House and Senate rule books, there are opportunities, especially on the Senate side, for minorities to block what a majority wants to do. Now, of course, things get a little tricky when we think about what majority and what minority are we talking about, because a majority in the Senate isn't necessarily a majority of public opinion in the country. And especially given that Republicans win in very small or even large, low population states, Republican can hold a majority of the seats and yet a minority of the population. And so depends on what your benchmark is.
But just to be kind of this brass tacks here, you've got, let's say a faction within the Republican Party that might actually be concerned about deficits. And so they might say, hey, look, if we get rid of the filibuster, we have no power. And so it's with the filibuster that they can kind of leverage their role, because their votes are necessary. They become the pivot vote to get things done. And the Democratic side, if we go back to when the progressives in the House under Joe Biden were trying to push legislation, there were, one or two moderates in the Senate who didn't like that progressive agenda, and they were able to use their power as a minority within their party and the chamber to stop things.
True. And of course, their power should be, those sort of the folks in the middle, their power should actually be greater in a system of majority rule, right?
Mhm.
Because their votes then in a world of small majorities, they're the critical votes, right? If you need 60, Joe Manchin didn't have any extra say when you needed 60. It was the actual minority party that had to say. So one might think the moderates, instead of always saying, wow, we don't want to get rid of, we value bipartisanship, we should keep 60, their power might be greater at majority. However, keep in mind, who are the moderates in either party? They're not the main center of that party, right? And so they need some protection from blame as well. They don't want to be the determining vote on something that's going to be controversial back home. Susan Collins doesn't want to be that. Lisa Murkowski on Save America, on mail-in balloting bans, she doesn't want to be the one who becomes quite visible, the one if you were to total world of majority rule.
Yeah, I think you've done more to clarify something that has been a puzzle to so many people. Why is it that the Republicans just don't get rid of the filibuster? And you could see Donald Trump just shaking his head like, what's the issue here? Let's go back, though, to the 1974 legislation. As you said, it failed to achieve its main objectives, which was to create a regular order, coherent, and predictable path for passing budgets. Deficits have gone up. On the other hand, it's really striking its lasting power. I mean, we talk about budgets. There's something to say about Congress. I mean, there is a process. There are institutions. There are procedures. And those all have their origins in 1974. So would you say, even if the outcome is disappointing from the perspective of 1974, the fact that there is a process at all is a testament to the lasting power of that bill?
Sure. And I think as social scientists, our problem here is like the counterfactual, like what would it look like if they didn't have the budget process on the books? So yeah, there's certainly a standard here, right? A calendar here, so that the focus on fiscal on October 1, otherwise a shutdown, that does become disciplining, even if it takes Congress a while to get to the point. And one thing, as you mentioned at the outset, right, the creation of the Congressional Budget Act, Congressional Budget Office, has actually been quite valuable to lawmakers on both sides of the aisle and in majority and minority positions. And these nonpartisan bodies, it has been very hard for them to kind of protect their reputation as nonpartisan. CBO is, I think, works very hard at it, become a target of Republicans of late, but it has so far managed to maintain that sort of reputation as a body of expertise that either party, if they want to, can lean on to leverage its positions.
Yeah, it's really striking about the Congressional Budget Office. Just about everything in Congress has been pulled in a partisan direction, and yet the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, has resisted that. Do you have any sense of why is it that it seems to be kind of this anomaly in a very partisan body?
So think about first the structure and the appointment. The leadership is involved, and the chairs and the ranking members of the majority minority party on the budget committees are involved. It rotates between the House having the pick and the Senate having the pick. And it's 4-year terms, so it's not necessarily going to align with who's ever in power today. So that's one thing. There is something baked into the system for the selection of the person, and there's no presidential appointment going on here, like there is, for instance, for the Accountability Office, the legislative auditor, right, where the president makes the appointment. So there's some sort of legislative sort of president proofing from some of the politics. Second, right off the bat, mid 70s and into the 80s, the first CBO head, Alice Rivlin, she was at odds with the Democratic majority on a couple of issues. And you see that periodically where the CBO is not just giving estimates that appeal to the majority party. And that sort of playing against type, I think, has been pretty valuable for at least building their reputation for nonpartisanship, at least making it harder to chip it away.
And then the folks who work there, I mean, look, universities have a lot of problems, but CBO is a great place to get a job. And we've had plenty of students who've gone there various positions. And these are not partisan appointments. These are based on expertise.
For sure, for sure. Yep. Yes, and the information, the accessibility to members, and members need them in part because the CBO is basically directed to give a score, like the impact on spending and revenues for every bill that gets reported from committee, and that can be quite valuable to members trying to push their particular legislation.
And when you look back over time in terms of the scoring, this is like an inside Washington phrase, meaning the analysis by the Congressional Budget Office as to whether a particular bill is going to increase the deficit, how taxes are going to play out, what are going to be the consequences in terms of accessibility for Americans. Have those projections been, in the ballpark, or can you explain them based on just, honest, analytic kind of miscalculations, or can you see like someone's finger on the scales?
So I think where the CBO has missed the boat, it has been because the growth expectations don't pan out, or a misunderstanding or miscalculation about how healthcare legislation will affect the numbers of insured and who can use laws and so forth. So, and CBO, to its credit, will go back and kind of try to explain why their estimates were off. But it does create fodder for their opponents to try to use against them. But CBO is, I trust them that they are, they need to keep political support on their side. Like nobody's independent in Washington. You need political support. And so they are trying to be more responsive, what we call sort of the dynamic scoring. So if a law is going to increase economic activity, can you then bring that into your score to say that has a bigger impact than it might otherwise. So they are kind of growing with the times here, but it's not easy. Not easy when you're in the spotlight, especially on big important bills on reconciliation.
We've got a bunch of questions here from you all, and if you're in the room, we're going to pass around cards, and please give us questions. So you mentioned earlier that it's the incentive system that has really kind of tripped up this 1974 piece of legislation. Are there things that could be done to incentivize Congress to follow the process more than it has? I mean, would you say, if you were playing God, or let's say Speaker of the House, that you could say, if we did this, it might be more relevant?
So it's interesting. There's been no shortage of budget reform proposals over the last 20 plus years. And I can say a little bit about ones which try to go after incentives, but most of the reform proposals are all about structure, right? The most prominent one is rather than say annual budgets and annual spending bill deadlines, make it a 2-year, right? Do biennial budget. And the answer, or the cause of the rationale for it is, well, look how bad Congress is at meeting a 1-year budget. So that type of rearranging the deck chairs it's never been very persuasive to me. Other types of reforms would be things like, rather than put a real deficit target, put a debt to GDP target, change the targets, make it harder to waive the budget rules and so forth. But those are all process reforms that aren't necessarily going after your question of like, how do you change lawmakers' incentives? Those sometimes there's discussions, well, no budget, no pay. But and that may or may not be constitutional depending on how it gets written, because there is a constitutional amendment about how Congress can't put aside all the salary constitutional issues. There may be ways to do it, and it's been tried periodically. You get a little small dose successes, but does it solve the broader problem that the budget carries all the partisanship that's in Congress? It becomes the focal point of partisanship because there's so little other legislating going on. It's very hard to do that unless you're going to find a way to temper partisanship in this electoral competition, which seems a little hard.
Question from folks here. And basically the question comes to this. In Minnesota, the legislature and governor have to sign a balanced budget by July 1st, in odd years. Why doesn't Congress adopt the balanced budget law?
So I think the economists would tell us that balanced budgets at the federal level are more problematic given the federal government's responsibility and Congress and the president's responsibility to address matters of economic recession, for sure, wars, right, episodes or global pandemics, financial crisis, where there's an expectation of this sort of Keynesian dynamic, which we're definitely need to do deficits and deficit spending in order to generate recoveries. That's kind of the classic economist's answer to that question, which is, in our political terms, right, was there different sort of inherent responsibilities or expectations we have at the national level that we don't have for the states.
Well, let's just take a wild leap here and say that Congress is not known for following every dictum from economists.
For sure.
So what else might be going on here that might be preventing a balanced budget reform?
So lawmakers don't like to tie their hands, right? As we call them, single-minded seekers of re-election, they don't like to impose costs, right? Concentrated, visible costs. They prefer to give concentrated, visible benefits today and buck the cost to the future. And that's probably not possible with a balanced budget. So, right, balanced budget, you're gonna invert it, right? Cost today for benefits in the future. And that's like backwards, right? Backwards for members of Congress.
There's a recent editorial in the Washington Post, which talked about the current fiscal pattern in Congress as self-assassination, because the slope of rising deficits and debt is such a threat to our future. And if you break that down as to why it's happening, it's just what you described. That is, Democrats want to have money to spend on climate change, or they'd like to see the subsidies for the Affordable Care Act extended. Republicans would most prefer to cut taxes. And so we're getting both of those. If you had balanced budget, it wouldn't be possible.
For sure. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's the politics of this. It's just that the incentives here are so strong that balanced budgets would kind of put an end to Washington politics as we've known it. Yeah. So we were talking a moment ago about reconciliation, and this is such an exciting topic that one of our folks here wants us to talk about it more. And one of the kind of inside baseball components of reconciliation is the role of someone known as the parliamentarian. Who is the parliamentarian, and what do they do?
So, well, first I should let you know that I have always wanted to be the Senate parliament. Well, I really want to be Goldie Gopher, but put that aside. I think that's now out of reach. I've always wanted to be the Senate parliamentarian, and I am finally the Senate parliamentarian. However, it's the GW faculty Senate parliamentarian, and never the twain shall meet. So legislative bodies generally have parliamentarians, and their job is not to tell senators what to do and not to make rulings in front of the chamber, but to give advice. They interpret the rules. And you might say, well, how hard can it be? Like, why do you need someone to interpret the rules? Well, the rules don't cover every single circumstance that comes up, especially because lawmakers try to come up with circumstances to circumvent the rules. So the Senate parliamentarian, first of all, interprets the rules. She interprets the Budget Act. She interprets a pesky part of the Budget Act called the Byrd Rule that tries to constrain members. And she interprets the precedents, like past decisions. So she needs, as most parliamentarians need, she to be credible, she also needs, right, a reputation for nonpartisanship, right? You can't have the other, well, obviously, if the other party thinks that the parliamentarian is giving advice to advantage the majority party, it undermines her credibility, and it is now a she parliamentarian. So she's there as the arbiter. But the question is, right, majorities aren't presiding officers. There's no rule that says the majority has to or rule in the way the parliamentarian advises. It's just that that's the way sort of Anglo-American legislatures and parliaments, that's how they've historically operated, right? Some expectation of what the rules are so that you can plan your strategies accordingly.
This gets to an element of Congress that is sometimes missed, which is there are the rules that are written that have to be followed. Then there are the norms. And the norms are influential if they're accepted. And is this one of those norms that the parliamentarian has a role that is important and that has some influence on each party when they're in the majority, when they could be calling the shots? Instead, they say, no, we're not going to use our power because of respect for this norm.
For sure. And like, you put your finger on it, right? It's like this norm of it's forbearance. I have this power. We could use this power, but we're going to restrain ourselves. And that's not like how we normally think about what goes on in this highly partisan Congress, but there is that norm, right? But then the question is, right, do the parties respect the norm because it's a norm, expectations of how they should operate, or is it more strategic? Do they expect to benefit from observing the norm either today or when they are in the minority? So whichever the reasons, probably both, the persistence of that norm leads to sort of some degree of routine, not sort of totally exploiting the rules to serve your party's advantage.
Of course, we're sitting on a university campus. Students are, really energized about politics now, particularly in Minneapolis because of recent events. And there are a bunch of students who are asking questions, one of which is, how can we impact this process? Why do we feel victim of Congress and its failure to budget properly?
So, I mean, it is sort of the question we always get, and it's probably the most important one we have in American politics, is like, how do you make change as an individual? So the question of how you make change, typically my usual answer is vote, organize, right? Mobilize. If there's something you believe in, you try to build a coalition and support and turn out so that lawmakers can see it in their electoral interest to be more responsive. I think the challenge here is that the question is, are there folks who care about, like, do voters care about budgets? And oftentimes it's just too, apart from TSA lines, it's often too abstract. People can see it in terms of healthcare access. They can see it in terms of student loans, the cost of student loans. But otherwise, like, the question is, if you mobilize, like, what are you trying to mobilize to get Congress to do?
Thinking back to 1974, at this moment is interesting because, as you said, the motivation, the driver for the 1974 reforms were very specific. It was the fact that the budget process was had fallen apart. Deficits were rising. Congress had basically abdicated its power of the purse. And here we had presidents who were using something called impoundments. That is, Congress would pass a budget that would appropriate funds. President would sign that piece of legislation and then not follow it. Sound familiar?
Indeed. Very.
So what is the lesson for 1974 to 2026? Is this a moment, or are we coming upon a moment where we might see, a resurgence in Congress to both grab back the power of the purse, take seriously its responsibilities? I think all of us were struck by the opinion by Judge Gorsuch in the tariffs case, where he really took Congress to task. I mean, here was a ruling that was striking down Donald Trump, but he was blaming Congress, or not, in part, for what was happening, and he didn't spare any punches there. So are we approaching a kind of 1974 moment now?
So we're approaching it only in the sense that we've got presidential behavior that looks on spades like Nixon's behavior. But as we've been talking about, the entire political and partisan system doesn't look anything like it looked 50 years ago. And so the question is, like, is it the case that both parties want to rein in Trump's impoundments? It's not clear, at least publicly, that Republicans are willing to do it. So there's, on the one hand, you have seen in the most recent round of spending bills restoring of funding that has been seemingly impounded by in 2025 by OMB in the Trump administration. If you go into the nitty gritty, it's not entirely clear that those monies are being released, right? And so seems to be you need more transparency on what OMB is doing. But it does seem, at least behind the scenes, when they write these spending bills, there's been a look at what Trump is doing and tried to restore those monies. But you wouldn't note it by looking at who's doing the most talking publicly about it. Republicans do not want to challenge the Trump administration publicly. There has been a fair amount, it seems, behind closed doors. Katie Britt from Senator Alabama, do not cut money from the University of Alabama. Right? And funny enough, those monies came right back to the University of Alabama. Don't cut money from the Oklahoma weather station, the Republican chair of the Appropriations Committee said quietly to the White House, but not publicly in a way that would bolster this congressional effort. So, yeah, the situation seems the same, but it's not clear that there's any bipartisan support for beating back in a very institutional way or a process way of changing and trying to rein in.
This is something that's always interesting because our deep partisan mold for today lead us to always see things in a partisan way. But what you're talking about are kind of the institutional incentives. And so could there be Democrats looking at what Donald Trump is doing thinking, well, there's a good chance there's going to be a Democratic president come 2028. How would he use the power or she use the power of rescission?
Yeah, I would not be surprised to see some of that resurge. And obviously we don't know, and it depends on norms within the White House.
Well, I mean, let's take, ICE. I mean, you could see a Democratic president in the future, after a campaign in which ICE is no doubt going to be center stage, deciding to decapitate ICE. Yes, there'll be the functions of border control and internal immigration control, but the massive police operation that ICE has become could very well be decapitated using this power that Donald Trump is now wielding, which is refusing to spend money appropriated by Congress and signed into law by the president.
Well, when I see it, which I expect, I'll come right back to you and say you nailed it.
Yeah.
The one thing that we haven't mentioned here is what role the courts have played over this Trump second administration here, and many of these impoundment cases the impoundment question hasn't come up to the Supreme Court, and members of Congress themselves don't have standing typically to sue. Most of these battles have been sort of these incremental little battles, like contract by contract, nonprofit group by nonprofit group. And most of these battles are sent basically to the Court of Claims as contract disputes. And so I think members of Congress, they're happy to sit back and wait for the courts to step in and say, Congress has the power of the purse. But the court has not done that. And so one question is whether we see that case yet to come, or are these questions unresolved, creating the opportunity for the next Democratic president to play the same game?
Okay, well, let's stare into the crystal ball here. Neither of us are judicial experts, but we have been following politics for a while. And, looking at that tariff decision, some of the arguments and the kind of judicial attitude, which is, yes, we support executive power, but there are limits. And specifically, there are limits when there are explicit constitutional procedures and language that has to be followed. And you would think power of the purse would be right at the top of that.
You would think, but we haven't. Those cases have not come up, and it may be why the administration has not found a way to get that case to the Supreme Court, because maybe they don't want the answer, right? They don't want to find that they're on the losing end of that as well.
There are a couple questions here that circle back to an issue you raised, which is that, yes, Donald Trump looks to be astride the political system. He's issued more executive orders in his first year than he did over the 4 years of his first term, and has set a record. So here you've got a president that looks, quite imperial. On the other hand, sometimes quietly, sometimes less quietly for those of us who follow what's going on in Congress, Congress is pushing back. And you mentioned the budgets that were signed off on in the fall. But we've got probably a $200 billion bill coming due for the Iran war. And, how would you expect Congress to leverage the president's need for that money to get its way?
So I'm not that optimistic that Congress will act as a unified actor against Trump on the money. There is certainly some reluctance amongst Republicans about the size of what's purported to be the ask. There's some notion they might do it through reconciliation, which seems a challenge, but some effort to do that. I think we don't. I'm not really expecting it. I think if there's a dynamic here, it will be because of reluctance within the Republican Party. It will be a story about what happens to those 2 or 3 Republicans who either are up for reelection in purplish states, or there are a small number of them, McConnell, Tillis, leaving office, who have the fortitude to try to rein in what the majority's responsiveness. But I don't think it's going to be a bipartisan story. I think it'll be the question of what exactly is going on within the Republicans.
And so what I'm not hearing from you is, the kind of fiscal mindset that we might have heard 2 decades ago, which is $200 billion on top of, this record-setting terror that we're on and expanding the debt. That language is not going to be there. Instead, it's going to be more this internal and political game of a few Republican senators or members of Congress, members of the House, who hold back.
I mean, that's my sense, but of course, we don't quite know how long this war lasts, what public opinion will look like on it, or whether it's just kind of more of the same, just over half opposed, just under half favor. So the question is there public pressure on Congress to do something here, given the impact, the size of this request? It's not been the record we've seen at least since the early 90s.
So you watched Congress all these years and you've studied it. Maybe you could help us think of a menu of things that Congress might include in an Iran war bill. For instance, reporting requirements. Republicans are very disappointed at the lack of information they're getting. Could they put requirements in this spending bill saying, the Secretary of War / Defense needs to come to us with this information at this set of increments, or maybe Democrats will push for some sort of set of limits on that money based on a calendar. We're not going to give you the $200 billion. Maybe we give you $50 billion for the first month. Could you just walk through what would a menu look like? I'm not saying it's going to be adopted. I'm not asking you to speculate, but what would be the kind of tools that members of Congress might consider, including in a Iran war piece of legislation?
So a couple of things. So first, and the quasi-model here is the Iraqi surge in 2007 and a request for troops and money by the Bush in his second term after a bad midterm for the Bush administration. But in that case, it was a Democratic Congress and a Republican White House. And they did put precisely the types of things you're suggesting: benchmarks, what has to happen by what date, reporting requirements, what has to happen in order to us to release more money, and so forth. So that type of kind of rigorous oversight is certainly their strong past practice for that. The question is, can you get that on a bipartisan basis if Republicans are still in control? So one opportunity is those types of either benchmarks, reporting requirements. And Congress often uses it, still uses this, successful, sometimes not, but actually what we call them limitation amendments. If you do X, we will defund this Pentagon office for something. So those have been in last 2 spending bills for a Pentagon secretary's travel budget, which pisses off the secretary's travel office. but you could see them doing more of those, which are perfectly like historically valid ways of trying to do it. That's my sense. The other way to sort of think about this as well is to say, what else do other senators or members or Democrats or Republicans want in order as the condition? So in other words, in order for you to get this money, we want 50 billion for Ukraine, right? So how do you think and not divide up the pie in a different way, but how do you expand the pie so that there's more interest amongst lawmakers to get in the game to support it, right? Democrats might want Ukraine money. Well, the cost is going to be giving more leeway to the president on Iran. So,
if you have been listening for the last 45 minutes to what's going on here, talking to Sarah Binder, this might be the most important thing, because I would say 100% of journalists have no idea of what you've just talked about. And I think you've just laid out kind of the future of kind of congressional politics with regards to the Iran money. Let me just pose another question along these lines. The level of disregard that Donald Trump has for Congress is epic. And so you've just run through a number of different ways Congress might, try to check the president. What if Donald Trump doesn't care what Congress says? I mean, are these things where Congress is saying, we are not going to give you this money? Is that a hard check? Is that literally, the check is sitting there where we are not going to sign it unless you do X, Y, and Z, and there's nothing that the president can do other than to follow the dictums of Congress?
I mean, that's the ultimate norm here is the rule of law and the anticipation that the players are going to observe it. And that's, I mean, if the president ignores congressional dictates in law, which in essence, which Democrats would say he is doing by impoundments and so forth, then the jig is up, right? Mm-hmm. And in part because the usual solution, go to court, it's not always lawmakers don't have that type of institutional standing unless the entire chamber is going to agree we're going to try to sue on behalf of the institution.
On the other hand, Donald Trump appears to be heading to Congress to ask for more money. So he does recognize that there is a power of the purse, that he can't just start writing checks without an appropriation. So there is that minimal acceptance of the constitutional system.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to keep in mind in this vein is the administration does appear, not always, it's not, I don't think, on some of the ICE and the deportation concerns, but on other areas, sort of respecting the decision of the court, right? For instance, on the tariff case, which many people speculated that the administration was not going to do. So, yeah, I mean, we are in this world of trying to know what's the future of all these institutions and do they survive the Trump administration? That's one of these sort of key questions about how much respect for the rule of law there still is and will be.
I want to go back to where we started, which was Walter Mondale, and this surprising element of a liberal icon, Walter Mondale, who was a big promoter of fiscal discipline, who was a surprising part of this coalition that passed the 1974 Budget and Impoundment Act, and was also consistent voice for insisting that for liberals to demonstrate that they are making a positive difference, they needed to be more attentive to data and to program evaluation than almost anyone else. That was how you were going to demonstrate that there was actually an improvement. Well, the liberal critics were very harsh against Walter Mondale, and they leveled several criticisms. One is, well, are you naive? You've just given power to these new budget committees, which we can anticipate because of who controls the Appropriations Committee in 1974 and today, that they will be stocked with conservatives. And so you've just given a new power to those who want to basically cut off spending for liberal programs. Has that played out? Have we seen those new budget committees serve as conservative bulwarks who are holding back spending on liberal programs?
Not at all, right? The budget committees, in fact, it's not exactly a prize committee assignment in either chamber, right? In either party. So, and I think this is sort of what the reformers in 74, whether they anticipated or not, I don't think they anticipated that, yes, that the budget would become kind of pretty central to trying to coordinate the sort of fiscal policy. But I don't think they anticipated how partisan those roles would become, right? That all the partisan disputes over policy, they get centered in the budget, on these budgets and on appropriations bills. And so they take on the character of their parties, as you said, Republicans wanting to cut taxes and Democrats wanting to expand the social welfare state. And that means you don't have that conservative, small c conservative bulwark.
Could you just give us a few kind of iconic liberals and conservatives who've used the budget process to push their agenda, just so it's a little less abstract? Yeah. People will be like, oh yeah, I know that name.
It's a good one. Harder to come up with actual names for, like, I think we know, if we think about Bush tax cuts, right. 2001, 2003, right, becomes the sort of this signature accomplishment early on in the Bush administration, right? Cutting taxes, almost all Republican votes, no Democratic votes. On the Democratic side, certainly Klobuchar, more recently Patty Murray, to Bernie Sanders on the social welfare spending and using reconciliation to pursue those gains. And Sanders, of course, had been budget chair. So key names that we see sort of boil down into reconciliation, who become then the pushers of those priorities.
I mean, this is the kind of striking part of this new budget politics that emerges after 1974. Senator Mondale and others thought it would change the politics, but what we saw instead is the politics changed the process, and the partisans just kind of adapted. They came to see reconciliation not as this gee whiz, process that was going to lead us to coherent, consistent budgets, but rather as another tool to kind of push their agendas.
Well, for sure. And at the end of the day, like, the rules, they're not magic, right? They can't enforce themselves, and they can't protect themselves from very ambitious parties seeking to use the process to their party's advantage.
We started early on talking about the Congressional Budget Office, and and you made the point, yeah, it's surprisingly professional. And in a very partisan body, it's certainly alert to the partisanship, but it has, maintained credibility. It's not the only one in Washington. There's the Government Accounting Office, that's very important. And, for a while, the independent counsel, they were also another, the
IGs.
Yeah, IGs, yeah, the investigative. Do you see kind of, even in this time of hyperpolarization, several institutions across the legislative and executive branches that are continuing to kind of run the flag of I don't want to say nonpartisan, but at least honest scoring?
Well, they are certainly trying, but the pressures against them are hard. Certainly in the inspectors general, if the president fires once before their terms are over and appoints people who don't have that reputation and that experience and background, that's hard for this sort of core of inspectors general. And GAO, same thing. They're waiting for the process to generate a new director, but the president gets to make the choice, subject to some constraints. There's a lot riding on these appointments and the ability of whoever gets put in these positions to kind of sustain that type of credibility.
Yeah, so don't hold out too much hope. Okay, folks, this has been an incredible hour. And I really want to thank you, Sarah Binder, for being with us. This is, if you're paying attention, this is one of the most enlightening conversations that I think we've had in some time, and particularly on a topic that gets enormous press coverage. People talk about all the time. You've just pulled the screen back on it. Before we say goodbye to you, though, we want to just flag a few things. We've got some terrific events coming up. April 16th, the well-known Harvard professor, Theda Skocpol, will be here. talking about the world turned upside down, the politics in the time of Donald Trump. That is April 16th, and that will be available on Zoom and here in person, Humphrey School. We're also in the process of scheduling former Republican Senator Norm Coleman to participate in the Conservative Voices series that I've been hosting with former Republican member of Congress Vin Weber. We'll let you know when that is scheduled. We're excited to have Senator Coleman join us. For the Nagasaki Dialogues, we've got a terrific Washington Post columnist. We're not quite ready to announce that, but it'll be announced soon, and I think you'll share my excitement about that. Also wanted to make an announcement that one of the really terrific programs here at the Humphrey School called the Policy Fellows, which was started by Walter Mondale and Ambassador Jerry Joseph 36 years ago. It's still going strong, and this is the time to apply. If you are mid-career and you want to make a difference, and you're looking to work with other people across party lines, there's like National Guard here and people from Greater Minnesota. It's really a remarkable array of Minnesotans participating. This is the time to apply. You can find it online at the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance. It's called Policy Fellows. Apply or encourage other people to apply. It's I think, one of the most remarkable programs around. There's an info session coming up April 2nd. Again, that'll be online. This program will be up and available in 1 or 2 days on YouTube and all the other podcast available services. If you've liked today's program, please consider making a donation. There's a lot of time and effort that goes into this. We also want to thank, again, Penny and George, Bill George, the George Family Foundation for their generosity, and Sarah Binder. Thank you so much, and thank all of you for joining us.
Great. Thank you for your hard questions. It was awesome.